Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham. Now, when we look at images of war, they're often focused on the people most impacted by the violence. We see photos of dead babies and videos of people with lost limbs. But war doesn't just impact the people who are dead or injured. It also affects those doing the killing themselves. And that's true even when the people doing the killing are pulling the trigger from tens of thousands of miles away. Such is the thesis of Drone. It's a play directed by Andrea Ossoff, which will be presented by the Arab American National Museum at the Detroit Public Theater starting July 31st. To discuss it now, we have Andrea here to talk a little bit more. Welcome to the Metro, Andrea.
Hi, thanks so much for having me this morning.
Of course. So please talk about the play Drone and where the idea came from to showcase the aftermath of drone strikes.
Thank you. This project has been a long time coming. I've actually been working on it for many years. And of course, like many theatrical projects, was interrupted by the pandemic. But it first caught my attention way back in 2009 when I heard a story on Democracy Now! About a priest and some activists who were arrested outside of Creech Air Force Base for protesting drones. And that was a really interesting and strange story to me that started me down a path of doing some research. And as you know, the drone program was in its earlier stages compared to what we're seeing across the world now. And so I started doing research and researching not only what drone pilots are experiencing, but also how can we find testimonies of the people who are witnessing drone strikes, which are very hard to find, actually. So I started researching human rights organizations that were investigating this. Journalists found testimonies from Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia. And that started me on a journey of creating these characters that are fictionalized but based on a lot of research. So there's 3 characters in the play called the survivors that are based on real testimonies, even though I've rewritten them into poetry. And there's a storyline of an American pilot who wasn't necessarily a military pilot before, but he gets a job with a military contractor flying drones, and he gets sent out to Las Vegas, which is where Creech Air Force Base is located, out in the desert in Nevada outside of Las Vegas. At the time, it was the largest drone pilot military training base. Now there's a larger one in New Mexico. But so I started researching this, and over time, the play has evolved to try to really look at the issue of violence, global violence, the violence that the United States is involved in perpetuating and perpetrating, and also who it's impacting and how we can tell those stories simultaneously.
So the point is that war, doesn't just do violence to its victims, but it also does violence to the people who are committing the acts of war themselves. And I would love if you can dive into that a little bit more, because like you were saying, you have characters that are represented from all different aspects and walks of life that you've been able to put together based on real, true testimony. You have Elvis impersonators, a preacher, a sex worker.
Because Las Vegas,
So just seeing how you've been able to directly take a picture or a snapshot of Vegas and bring those stories to life. Can you just talk a little bit about that character building that you were going after?
Yeah, in a way, I think of this play as kind of a trilogy in my work, in the sense that I've been, as an Arab American artist, I've been making war and peace work for a very long time, both as a poet and as a theater maker. And I spent a lot of years in collaboration with a wonderful playwright named Linda Paris Bailey, who wrote a play called Speed Killed My Cousin that was about the impact of multi-generational military service on African-American families. And it's about an Iraq War veteran, a woman veteran, who comes back and is struggling with PTSD. So while we were doing that work, we started interviewing and doing story circles with a lot of veterans in Florida and Tennessee, in Arizona, around the country, and really learning about not only post-traumatic stress, but also what they call moral injury. Moral injury is like when you are involved in something that is so against your inner moral code that you cannot reconcile it. And it turns out that studies have shown that post-traumatic stress by itself isn't necessarily a driver of suicide, but moral injury is. And so when we think a lot about, I think a lot about, there was this moment in the Iraq War where we were actually losing more veterans to suicide than we were to combat. And that included Vietnam era veterans who still hadn't reconciled the Vietnam War, right? And so I think that the veteran community has a lot to tell us about what are we really doing in these wars and military interventions around the world and overseas, and particularly that are predominantly targeting people of color around the world, right?
The world.
What if they know something that we don't, right? So I wanted to also tell a story about a pilot who is not allowed to talk about what he's witnessing and what that silencing does to a person's mental health and to his family and all the people around him.
Now, Andrea, I want to do a spinoff question because you're Arab American, and your whole career as an artist, as a creative, has been talking about and highlighting the impacts of war from different facets, different directions. How much does war play a part in your everyday life when you're just going about? Because for us here in the United States, being, we don't often think about war and how it impacts our daily lives or the way it impacts those who may be in other countries who are directly linked to us. But when you hear about war and you think about it, especially throughout your life, how have you been able to cope with it yourself, knowing that it's impacting so many people from your culture and your background?
Yeah, I think like many immigrant communities, the Arab American community or Middle Eastern communities in the United States more broadly, we're very transnational, right? Some of us have family members in the countries, still in the countries that they've immigrated from. Some of us just have dear friends and loved ones in the Middle East. And so war is not this abstract, removed thing. It's, the last almost unbelievable, but that it's almost 2 years now of witnessing genocide on our phones, and the genocide against Palestinians, the bombing of, I'm Lebanese American. I was in the middle of creating a show in San Francisco when Lebanon was being bombed last fall. And I can't really express what it's like to try to make art while actively worrying about if someone you love is going to survive and be there tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. And most Americans don't think about that. Being Lebanese American, I've been thinking about there is a thing called war for as long as I can remember. I remember being in elementary school and some teacher had us do this exercise about drawing flags of where our families come from. And I was drawing a Lebanese flag and the teacher said, "Oh, they're at war, aren't they?"
Just
I was
casually to a child, yeah.
Right? I was 5. So we live with this reality as a reality that we are daily aware of. And that sometimes makes us feel, I'll speak for myself, sometimes makes me feel very alone, very removed from even my dearest, closest friends in the States for whom it's a news story, right? And so I'm a person who makes art to cope, to heal, to process, to express, so that I don't hold all that in by myself, and so that I can create spaces to talk about these things, to break those silences, to get communities to talk together about things in a way that makes it a human story, not just a news story.
Exactly, because war, no matter who you are, where you are, it impacts us all some way, in some shape or form. It doesn't matter. Right now, our guest is Andrea Asif, a playwright and performer. She's director of Drone, a new play presented by the Arab American National Museum and will be at the Detroit Public Theater starting July 31st. Now, we talked about the main character of Drone being a U.S. pilot, and you've joined Veterans for Peace. What is it like stepping into that point of view of the U.S. military veterans? Because you talked about that, and I thought it was especially important when you talked about the generational impacts of the African American soldiers as well, which I have family who've been fighting in war since the Civil War. I have the records there, so it goes all the way back for myself as well, and that trauma does bleed over. Yeah,
it definitely does. When I first started working with veterans, even some people in my own community were like, "What are you doing? Yeah. Why are you at the VA? Like, what's going on?" But and it's been some of the most challenging work I've ever done. But what I found is working with veterans in recovery, veterans who are trying to make sense of what they've been through and what they have witnessed and are trying to process, is that I think we get this assumption from mainstream media and from Hollywood that veterans are the most patriotic people. They're really not. They're very conflicted about what they've seen, right?
Yes, the ones I have experienced with as well, yes.
Absolutely. And I think especially veterans of color have a more complex view of U.S. militarism, even than sometimes white folks have an analysis of. I've seen that play out even in like theater workshops, right, that I've facilitated in that context. But what I've come to find is that there are some amazing organizations and activists and leaders like Veterans for Peace, like About Face, folks who have firsthand experienced war and want to speak out and want to work for peace after that experience. There's a lot of folks. And we can be allies in this work, And even with veterans who maybe aren't there yet in terms of speaking out, but are really just working through their own healing process, what I've found is like, I have a point of view as an Arab American about war. You have a point of view. But if we can get on stage together and both of us are essentially sending an anti-war message and are saying, we got to stop doing this, then I can work with you. Then we can be allies in that work.
Love it. And, just thinking about the work that you've been able to do and just connecting with you and understanding a little bit more about who you are personally, why does Drone matter so much to you, especially for those who may not have a deeper or empathetic understanding of the impacts of war and drone warfare?
I think this particular aspect of warfare is at the level of an existential question for humans right now in the way that climate change is, right? We are looking at a moment where humans have developed the technology to create artificial intelligence controlled death machines.
It's scary to think about.
It's very scary. We've been thinking about it through science fiction, for decades, but it's no longer science fiction. It's reality now. It's reality. And I think that we are still early enough that we can, if we get involved, if we start talking about it, if we feel like we have a voice, then we can start being involved in shaping the policies, the rules. What are the rules going to be when there's no longer a human conscience behind whether or not to pull a trigger? And right now, the U.S. is in a place where all of our use of weaponized drones is international, but it's rapidly getting closer to home, right? Every police department in the nation wants a drone fleet. Can you imagine if we have not yet solved the problem of systemic racism and the targeting of Black people and people of color by police? Now we're going to give them flying death machines, right? And what is making that legally even maybe possible is the border. Right now, there are drones flying over the U.S.-Mexico border, patrolling immigration. But the fact that they're flying on the border means that they're crossing into U.S. airspace, right? So they are actually setting precedent about what might be possible in the U.S. And if we don't see the connection between our issues, between the Black Lives Matter movement, between no human is illegal, right, between Free Palestine, if we don't make these connections and we don't get together to shape policy and to shape the future, then it's going to happen to us, and rather than us having a voice in what kind of world we want to live in. So my hope is that the drone project gets people thinking about these things, about surveillance, right? Surveillance of communities of color, and what happens when that, like, I want to share that a lot of times people pin the escalation of the drone program on Obama. But in fact, the shift from the use of drones as surveillance technology to weaponry was in 2003 under the George W. Bush administration with the Iraq War. So I think it's really important that we remember history and that we got here. That's where it started, was the Iraq War under George W. Bush. And yes, it has been escalating steadily ever since, whether there's a Republican or a Democrat in the office, right? So we need to, as a populace, say, whoa, we didn't sign up for artificial intelligence death patrols.
So when people do push back, when you bring up the fact that Obama wasn't the first, when you try to explain that to folks, a lot of folks will say, well, Obama did do a lot more drone strikes than we've seen from even President Biden, as well as even President Donald Trump right now. So what do you say, and how do you combat that when they try to throw that in your face?
It's true and it's not true, because it depends on where you look, right? We often forget to look at Yemen. Trump has done a whole lot of drone strikes in Yemen in the first presidency and now. Somehow Yemen doesn't get the kind of global attention as, say, Iraq and Afghanistan did, right? But it doesn't mean we're not doing it. Somalia, right? Why is it so hard to find testimonies from Somalia? Because global journalism isn't listening to Somalia, right? So I think I am certain that the drone program has continued to escalate. Like it's on an upward ramp, that because these things are planned, through the military, sometimes decades in advance, right? It is true, Obama did not do enough to stop it, and I was very disappointed that he was in favor of it. And I think the play gets at some of those arguments about why people think drones are good. Oh, but it's protecting our troops, and you won't have to be on the ground.
That was going to be one of my questions to you about this, the argument that it protects human life in that way.
Well, I've had the opportunity to interview Iraq War veterans who have seen it from the perspective of a combat soldier. And the problem is we're always told that these weapons are precise, but in fact, they're really not. I've heard stories about U.S. soldiers being targeted by our own drones because somebody made a mistake, or a drone going down in the desert and U.S. soldiers being sent to protect the drone at risk of their own human lives because the technology is very expensive, right? I mean, so there is a bigger conversation here about who is it really for? Who is it really serving? When you think about how much money the drone producers and military contractors are making on this and how much money is at stake, a Reaper or a Predator drone, the really big ones, they're like $16 to $40 million a piece. Right.
Andrea, I could talk to you all afternoon, honestly, about drone, the play, and the direction of it. But thank you so much, Andrea Ossoff, playwright and performer, director of Drone, a new play presented by the Arab American National Museum. It will be at the Detroit Public Theater on July 31st. Where can they find more information?
You can definitely go to the Arab American National Museum website. You can check out arttooaction.org, which is my organization. And come see us at Detroit Public Theater. We'd love to talk to you after the performance.
Love it. Thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
Coming up, what's happening at the historic Scarab Club after over 100 years of providing arts and culture for the community? You all stay right there. We'll be right back. This is the Metro.